I hope you enjoyed the break. I'm terribly excited to be here because I enjoy that conference, but also because I'm giving this talk, and that's kind of frightening on its own. I've been looking forward to it for weeks now. It's my 4th time at Clojure, and every time it's great to come back. Every time you come back to more friends and more memories of previous editions, and that's just like something I'm always looking forward to. So just as a reminder to all of you, enjoy yourself, talk to people, and just have a good time. And buy Miko and all the other organizers a drink if the opportunity arises. Before we get going, a little bit of context about myself. This is me getting soaked in Croatia 2 weeks ago. I'm a Clojure contractor, consultant, whatever you call that these days. And you can usually find me on the internet as Martin Klepsch. If you want to be in the know the next time I'm standing in the rain somewhere, you can follow me on Instagram. In the past, some 4 years ago now, I helped start CLJS with this fellow sitting over there, Juho of Metasin, and contributed to Boot a bit. And it's crazy to think that CLJS is about 4 years old now. This ClojureScript ecosystem has come so far. Like, all this JavaScript integration story has evolved so much in that time. I also wrote a bunch of Clojure libraries, none of which you probably heard of. But today I don't want to talk about any of that. Instead, I want to talk about documentation, as Miko already said, and specifically CLJ Doc. So just because I'm curious, like a quick show of hands, who has any idea what CLJ Doc is? Wow, that's pretty good. OK, well, then we can skip the talk. OK, so but before we get into like what it actually is, I just want to like give you a bit of a background story, how this came to be and why I like got into this rabbit hole. So it all kind of started late last year in December when the fellow sitting over there, Arne Bresseur, gave a presentation at the Berlin Clojure meetup. And he presented a small tool that helps you publish documentation. And it made me realize something. It made me realize that if you want to publish documentation for your Clojure library, that's actually pretty hard. And we can argue about if it's like difficult hard or just hard enough for most people not to do it. So the way I think about this is kind of like a funnel. So if you think about the people who publish Clojure libraries, that's this blue box, then a small portion of those people will make an active decision to publish documentation for their library, and they will look for the tools and do that kind of thing. Now, some of those people get stuck setting up the right tool. Some of those people get stuck when setting up the place where they can put the HTML files that this tool generates. And of all of those people that are left in this funnel, most of them forget to upgrade the documentation once they publish a new release. So I think it's fair to say that there's friction at every step in that process, and that friction eventually leads to like having an ecosystem where we have a lot of libraries that don't come with human-readable API documentation. As you can see, like all of these aspects are small in comparison to the amount of people that just don't do anything. So just to circle back to Arne's presentation for a moment, he published a script that helped you publish the API, HTML files that a tool generates, Kodox in that case, on a GitHub Pages branch. And so people could look at it. At that time, like, it was clearly more of a Band-Aid than a solution to that entire problem space. It made things better, but like, it didn't make the problem go away. After the talk, we talked about like how awesome it would be to have something like docsrs or hexdocs.pm, which are of Rust and Elixir, respectively, for the Clojure world. And if you're not familiar what these are, who's familiar with these tools? All right, so there's fewer people than familiar with CLJ Doc. So both of these are platforms that host documentation for libraries in their respective ecosystems. So DocsRS builds documentation for every Rust library that is being published into the crates system. I think that's what it's called. And HexDocs does the same for all the Elixir libraries. You can check out Bodil's immutable RS on DocsRS, for instance. And so we realized, oh, that would be really cool to have for Clojure, right? Like that would be cool. But we also realized, oh, that would be a lot of work, and we don't have the time to do it. So nothing really happened. Yeah, the days and weeks after the conference, I was like thinking, oh, well, yeah, maybe we can do it. Like, what could we do? But would it even be possible? Clojure is a very dynamic language, and so in order to figure out what functions are in a namespace, you effectively have to run that namespace. And if that namespace deletes your home directory, then it may be. So in order to do that kind of thing, you would need some sandboxing to analyze the code so you can extract the information that is relevant for your API documentation. Now, other languages provide static analysis for this, or it's easier to do static analysis for other languages. But in Clojure, like, there's such a dynamic language that this is a limited approach, you could say. I looked into Docker, I looked into AWS Lambda, I looked into Kubernetes. I was on the way to make this buzzword compliant. But yeah, I didn't end up using these tools. Somewhere at that point, I also gave a presentation at the Berlin Clojure meetup with some ideas I had, and like I was really excited about it at that time. This is kind of what I had. People weren't exactly excited. I'm not sure why. But experimenting a bit more with this isolation and sandboxing thing, I found a solution that is a total hack, but works great. So basically, everyday job. Instead of setting up some build form of some kind or whatever, I started using a tool that we all use on a regular basis. And I just want to explain how that works, because that's one of the core aspects of what makes CLJ Doc even possible. So when a user comes to CLJ Doc, they request some documentation. They say, look, I want a documentation for reframe. And if we don't have that documentation, that user can request the build of that documentation. And the moment they request that build, we start a job on CircleCI. So that's the big hack. Using build parameters, we parameterize what's being ran on CircleCI to the amount that we can analyze reframe instead of doing a generic build job. Some Clojure code runs, and if everything is all right, the build succeeds. At that point, the data that we extracted for the library is stored in a build artifact. So that's kind of like a file you can attach to build, and you can download that after the build completed. When CircleCI is done, it notifies us via a webhook. We download that file, and we integrate it into the CLJ Doc database. I hope that's clear so far. At that point, we also copy the Git repository of the project to integrate some more additional information, like the README and these kind of things. But that's comparatively straightforward. The user can follow that entire process through a build page like this. And so if there's an issue in that process, they're welcome to create an issue or ping us in Slack or do anything like raise their hands. So that's a bit of backstory, kind of. Now we're at a Clojure conference, and all the talks at Clojure conferences I heard have a slide that has rationale written on it. So I figured, well, got to do it. So I'm just going to try to answer the question, like, why am I working on it? Why am I not going to the park? And maybe even why might you want to work on it? First of all, writing documentation is hard work, right? Like, we all write code, that's hard work, and maybe some of us also write documentation, and that's hard work too. But it's also worthwhile. Every time someone reads the documentation you wrote, you save them potentially hours of guessing and fumbling of how to do certain things with your library. And if you think about it, it's kind of the same with the code itself. Open source code provides value because people can reuse it and save time because they don't have to write that code over and over and over again. So with good documentation, what you enable is allowing people not to fumble and guess for hours again and again and again. So I'm just trying to sell you that you write better documentation, please. Or more. Now, CLG Doc doesn't auto-generate documentation for you. Maybe that's coming in version 2, but that's still like sort of on the drawing board. I'm not willing to share my secret plans about that yet. But what CLG Doc can do is eliminate most of the friction that we saw in that diagram that I had on the screen earlier. Now, my hypothesis is that if we free up all this time, like choosing a tool that does this, setting up the place where we put those HTML files, all that kind of thing, we free up a lot of time of library authors that they may then use to go to the park or maybe to write documentation. And I'm fine with both of these outcomes, just to be clear. Also, putting all documentation in one place enables like a bunch of interesting things. So documentation is always available under a consistent URL. You don't have to like Google documentation for this project and it's spread over the internet. It's all in one place. And so that allows for a couple of interesting user experience improvements, you could say. Like this tool I built recently that allows you to switch between projects that you recently viewed. So kind of like Slack, you hit K, and this thing comes up. Does it come up? Yeah, it's not playing on my screen. And you can search through projects that you recently used and just switch between that. And you can imagine that this would be easily extendable to also search for vars in the same project you're using or do all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's the kind of stuff, like if we would have all the documentation in individual places, we could not do that. And I think that's an interesting situation. Now, if all this works out, we should end up with better documentation, period. And yeah, so just to summarize, if we make it easier to publish documentation, we get better documentation. By having better documentation, we have a better ecosystem, and a better ecosystem means profit, obviously. Also, better documentation obviously means our ecosystem is going to be more friendly to beginners and newcomers who are just getting started and maybe are not able to read the source just yet. So this has all been like a little bit abstract so far, I guess. But I also want to show you a bit what CLG Doc is right now, what it can do, and what it may do in the future. In other words, let's take a quick tour about what CLG Doc currently allows you to do. So we're going to look at some stuff here. First is all the documentation is versioned. So if you publish a new version of your library, the documentation for that library will go up, and the old documentation will stick around. So people using the old version can still look at the old documentation. Then secondly, instead of just having API documentation, we enable library authors to bundle API documentation and articles in one thing. So you can see here on the left, we have a bunch of articles that have been provided to CLG Doc through a small configuration file. And you can also see that images that work on GitHub and links that work on GitHub are fixed accordingly, so they still work if they're rendered on CLG Doc. I think that's pretty great on its own. Obviously, we also have API documentation. That would be kind of a bummer if we didn't. Yeah, I just want to highlight a few specific things about that. One thing you can see here is you can see protocol methods. But I mean, this is all fairly basic, right? Like, if you use Kodox, you get the same. Actually, CLG Doc is on Kodox. I should totally is based on the analysis code of Kodox, and I want to give credit to that at that opportunity. Now, a few special things about the API documentation. One thing is CLG Doc is not just for Clojure. It's for Clojure script too. And so if you look at some documentation, for instance, this reframe interrupt namespace, you can see that it supports all platforms. And you can see that there are different doc strings for these two platforms. And that's highlighted in the documentation, and you can easily spot the differences between platforms, allowing you to be more efficient when targeting multiple platforms. Also, the source links are working perfectly in these kinds of situations. You can see that we have different source links for Clojure and Clojure script. The analyzer sort of extracts that, and we link that back to the GitHub repository. So I think that's very novel, I think. Another thing that was contributed by Kim Kinnear, I hope I get that right, is we're formatting arg lists with zprint. So if you have like some really complex arg list like this, it's just going to be printed beautifully, and you can read it like a human reads things and not like a machine reads things. So that's great. Another thing that I like a lot, all the documentation on CLG Doc is available offline. So if you type in the right URL, /download// blah blah, you can download a zip file with all the documentation for that project. And if you open the index.html in that zip file, you can see it has all the articles. It's a little bit stripped down, like it's a minimal bundle to keep you productive when you're sitting in your hammock or on the beach enjoying a drink. Now, I already said that we import the API into a database, and I think that's also one of the more interesting properties of CLG Doc. Putting stuff in a database allows you to answer like really, really pressing questions, like who wrote the longest doc string. So, and the winner is Kijma controllers register. Kijma was presented here last year, actually, and just look at that doc string. It's beautifully formatted with Markdown, and it's longer than the README of many projects I've seen. Just a note on Markdown. Nobody decided that Markdown is the de facto or is how you write doc strings. But I think Bojidar made a great point last year that we should make these kind of decisions in order to move forward and in order to enable people to use that kind of stuff. And I think he was calling for some standardization in that regard, that like Cognitect says, doc strings now support Markdown. Oh well, CLJ Doc now supports Markdown, so that's great. In summary, CLJ Doc today, totally platform aware. It knows what's going on in CLJS. It knows what's going on in Clojure. We have articles and API documentation on the same page, allowing you to easily switch between those. You can download the documentation for offline use. Everything's versioned, so if you want to view all documentation because you couldn't upgrade your library, just do it. And last, but certainly not least, it's backed by a database, enabling all kinds of interesting things that we may not yet even foresee. So this is all working today, right? You can go to CLJ Doc, that's what's already there. But let's talk a bit about what CLJ Doc could do tomorrow, or maybe the day after, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff on the slide, and I'm just going to touch on a few of those. Spec integration is one thing that has been suggested a lot and that I think is really interesting. Just imagine you have a function in your API documentation, and you would see, oh, this argument is of this spec, or conforms to this spec. And this function returns a value conforming to this spec. Potentially, you could even click on the spec and see other functions that produce or receive values matching that spec. And I think that kind of gets us in an area that was previously exclusive to Haskell and that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of exciting. Examples are another thing that have come up a lot. In the future, I hope that CLG Doc allows library authors and library users to attach documentation to vars, to namespaces, that kind of thing. There's thinking that this could be interactive and non-interactive. Obviously, interactive is like a can of worms, and it's probably very hard to get it right. But like, I think just the general prospect of having interactive examples in your generated API documentation is thrilling. One thing I'm particularly excited about, but that's not even the biggest thing, I guess, or at least to most people, is what's called change detection there. So because we have the data about the API, we can diff the data, right? And I can, in theory, render a page that shows me between this and this version, the argument list of this function was changed and an element was removed. And so that's not accretion, that's removing stuff. So effectively, that's a breaking change. And what we can do is we generate a page between versions that just highlights that very, very clearly. And maybe that's not even for library users to consume, but for library authors. And they could see, oh, I made this change, and it's a breaking change, and I didn't even think about this. Like, this didn't even occur to me that I'm like introducing this breaking change and forcing it upon my users. Now, some other stuff, GraphQL, obviously, you have to have GraphQL. Mobile ready. Currently, the CLG documentation pages they're all right on mobile, but like they're not optimized for it. And because it's like a sidebar kind of layout, it's a little bit tricky, and I didn't want to introduce too much JavaScript. So I kind of pushed that off, but I hope to get there eventually. Documentation highlights is another thing I've been thinking about. Imagine you have like a function with the long doc string, like the register function we just saw. Like, that's the kind of thing the author of that library wrote that long doc string because they assume that this function is used a lot. So maybe the documentation can somehow highlight, look, this function is exceptionally well documented. Maybe take a look at it when you're like familiarizing yourself with the API and how to use it. Obviously, this is like, very unspecific, and we need to work out the details on that kind of stuff. But all these kind of things we can ship for all the libraries that are out there, and not just like for one that decides to upgrade the version. And I think that's kind of the exciting aspect about CLG Doc, that if we improve CLG Doc, we improve the documentation for each library that's out there, not just for one. So someone suggested that 2.5 minutes, that I should say how you use CLG Doc. I guess that kind of makes sense. So the first thing you should do if you're a library author, check that the documentation for your library can be built. Some stuff cannot be built, like there's a missing dependency, there's like some require missing, that kind of stuff. Like that just happens, and there's nothing CLG Doc can do about it. Add a batch to your README, so people can find the documentation. The batch will always point to the latest release, and after that, you're off to like going through all your sources and improving your doc strings. And if you then publish in your release, you can look at the fruits of your work. If you have any articles, any tutorials or stuff like that, beyond a README or a changelog, which are integrated automatically, you can incorporate that using a small configuration file or by just putting them in the doc folder. There's a bunch of documentation on all that. If you go to clgdoc.xyz, there's links how to use CLG Doc as a library user, how to use CLG Doc as a library author, and you can find all that. It's, I hope, relatively straightforward. I try to write reasonable documentation for this, but I may not always succeed, who knows. All right, so sort of getting into wrapping up here because it's 1 minute left. I just want to thank Clojurists together for their fantastic initiative of funding like Clojure open source stuff. Also want to thank Matheson and Jux and all the other companies that are listed there, as well as all the individual developers and members that are supporting this thing. I think it's great that people working on Clojure open source stuff get compensated in one way or another. So thanks to all of those people. Also, thanks to all the contributors to CLG Doc. No matter how small or big your contribution was, it made the project better. And I just want to praise you for doing so. And also thanks to all the people who provided feedback and had suggestions like the spec integration. Now, obviously, you're welcome to contribute. Check out github.com/cljdoc/cljdoc. I would be happy to welcome you to our little community. And if you need help setting up, I'm happy to pair with you. I'm happy to review your code. And I'll send you some super sweet stickers if you end up contributing. That's it. Thanks. And yeah.